The Secret Doctrine by Elena Petrovna Blavatsky, a facsimile of the original edition of 1888, printed by the Cunningham Press, Alhambra, California. Book 2, Part 3, Addenda, Science and the Secret Doctrine Contrasted. Section 2. The answers to mankind is offered by science. Quote from Huxley: "The question of questions for mankind, the problem which underlies all others, and is more deeply interesting than any other, is the ascertainment of the place which man occupies in nature, and of his relations to the universe of things." Unquote. The world stands divided this day, and hesitates between divine progenitors, be they Adam and Eve, or the lunar Petris and Bathybius Haeckelii, the gelatinous hermit of the briny deep. Having explained the occult theory, it may now be compared with that of the modern materialism. The reader is invited to choose between the two after having judged them on their respective merits. We may derive some consolation for the rejection of our divine ancestors in finding that the Haeckellian speculations receive no better treatment at the hands of strictly exact science than do our own. Haeckel's phylogenesis is no less laughed at by the foes of his fantastic evolution, by other and greater scientists, than our primeval races will be. As Du Bois-Reymond puts it, we may believe him easily when he says that ancestral trees of our race sketched in the Schöpfungsgeschichte are of about as much value as are the pedigrees of the Homeric heroes in the eyes of the historical critic. Unquote from Du Bois-Reymond. This settled, everyone will see that one hypothesis is as good as another, and as we find that German materialist, Haeckel, himself confessing that neither geology in its history of the past nor the ancestral history of organisms will ever rise to the position of a real exact science, a large margin is thus left to occult science to make its annotations and lodge its protests. The world is left to choose between the teachings of Paracelsus, the father of modern chemistry, and those of Haeckel, the father of the mythical Saussure. We demand no more. Without presuming to take part in the quarrel of such very learned naturalists as Du Bois-Reymond and Haeckel apropos of our blood relationship to those ancestors of ours which have led up from the unicellular classes, vermes, Arcania, Pisces, Amphibia, Reptilia to the aves, one may put in a few words a question or two for the information of our readers. Availing ourselves of the opportunity and bearing in mind Darwin's theories of natural selection, etc., we would ask science, with regard to the origin of the human and animal species, which theory of evolution of the two herewith described is the more scientific, or the more unscientific, if so preferred. 1. Is it that of an evolution which starts from the beginning with sexual propagation? 2. Or that teaching which shows the gradual development of organs, their solidification, and the procreation of each species, at first by simple, easy separation from one into two or even several individuals, then follows a fresh development, the first step to a species of separate distinct sexes, the hermaphrodite condition, then again a kind of parthenogenesis, virginal reproduction, when the egg cells are formed within the body, issuing from it in atomic emanations and becoming matured outside of it, until finally, after a definite separation into sexes, the human beings begin procreating through sexual connection. Of these two, the former theory, or rather revealed fact, is enunciated by all the exoteric Bibles except the Puranas, preeminently by the Jewish cosmogony. The last one is that which is taught by the occult philosophy, as explained all along. An answer is found to our question in a volume just published by Mr. S. Ling, the best lay exponent of modern science. He is the author of Modern Science and Modern Thought. In Chapter 8 of his latest work, A Modern Zoroastrian, the author begins by twitting all ancient religions and philosophies for assuming a male and female principle for their gods. At first sight, he says, the distinction of sex appears as fundamental as that of plant and animal. The spirit of God brooding over chaos and producing the world, he goes on to complain, is only a later edition, revised according to monotheistic ideas of the far older Chaldean legend, which describes the creation of cosmos out of chaos by the cooperations of great gods male and female. Thus, in the Orthodox Christian creed we are taught to repeat begotten, not made, a phrase which is absolute nonsense, an instance of using words like counterfeit notes, which have no solid value of an idea behind them. For begotten is a very definite term which implies the conjunction of two opposite sexes to produce a new individual." Unquote. However, we may agree with the learned author as to the inadvisability of using wrong words and the terrible anthropomorphic and phallic element in the old scriptures, especially in the Orthodox Christian Bible. Nevertheless, there may be two extenuating circumstances in the case. Firstly, all these ancient philosophies and modern religions are, as sufficiently shown in these two volumes, an exoteric veil thrown over the face of esoteric truth, and, as the direct result of this, they are allegorical, that is, mythological in form. But still they are immensely more philosophical in essence than any of the new scientific theories, so-called. Secondly, from the Orphic Theogony down to Ezra's last remodeling of the Pentateuch, every old scripture having in its origin borrowed its fact from the East, it has been subjected to constant alterations by friend and foe, until of the original version there remained but the name, a dead shell from which the spirit had been gradually eliminated. This alone ought to show that no religious work now extant can be understood without the help of the archaic wisdom, the primitive foundation on which they were all built. But to return to the direct answer expected from science to our direct question, it is given by the same author when, following his train of thought on the unscientific euhemerization of the powers of nature in ancient creeds, he pronounces a condemnatory verdict upon them in the following terms. Quote, "Science, however, makes sad havoc with this impression of sexual generation being the original and only mode of reproduction." Regarding this, see Part 1 of this volume, page 183, stanza 8. And the microscope and dissecting knife of the naturalist introduce us to new and altogether unsuspected, within brackets question mark, worlds to life, unquote. So little unsuspected, indeed, that the original asexual modes of reproduction must have been known to the ancient Hindus at any rate, Mr. Lang's assertion to the contrary notwithstanding. In view of the statement in the Vishnu Purana, quoted by us elsewhere, that Daksha established sexual intercourse as the means of multiplication, only after a series of modes, which are all enumerated therein. See Volume 2, page 12, in Wilson's translation. Which are all enumerated therein, it becomes difficult to deny the fact. This assertion, moreover, is found, note well, in an exoteric work. Then Mr. S. Lang goes on to tell us that, quote, "by far the larger proportion of living forms in number have come into existence without the aid of sexual propagation." He then instances Haeckel's monera, multiplying by self-division. The next stage the author shows in the nucleated cell, which does exactly the same thing. The following stage is that in which the organism does not divide into two equal parts, but a small portion of it swells out, and finally parts company and starts on separate existence, which grows to the size of the parent by its inherent faculty of manufacturing fresh protoplasm from surrounding inorganic materials. Unquote. Note, in this, as shown in Part 1, modern science was again anticipated far beyond its own speculations in this direction by archaic science. End of note. This is followed by a many-celled organism which is formed by germ buds reduced to spores or single cells which are emitted from the parent. When we are at the threshold of that system of sexual propagation which has now become the rule in all the higher families of animals. It is when an organism having advantages in the struggle for life established itself permanently that special organs developed to meet the altered condition, when a distinction would be firmly established of a female organ or ovary containing the egg or primitive cell from which the new being was to be developed. This is confirmed by study of embryology, which shows that in the human and higher animal species the distinction of sex is not developed until a considerable progress has been made in the growth of the embryo. In the great majority of plants, and in some lower families of animals, the male and female organs are developed within the same being, a hermaphrodite. Moreover, in the virginal reproduction, germ cells, apparently similar in all respects to egg cells, develop themselves into new individuals without any fructifying element, etc., etc., from pages 103 to 107. Of all which we are as perfectly well aware as of this, that the above was never applied by the very learned English popularizer of Huxley-Haeckelyan theories to the genus Homo. He limits this to specks of protoplasm, plants, bees, snails, and so on. But if he would be true to the theory of descent, he must be as true to ontogenesis, in which the fundamental biogenetic law, we are told, runs as follows. Quote, "The development of the embryo, ontogeny, is a condensed and abbreviated repetition of the evolution of the race, phylogeny. This repetition is the more complete, the more the true original order of evolution, palingenesis, has been retained by continual heredity. On the other hand, this repetition is the less complete, the more by varying adaptations the later spurious development, kenogenesis, has obtained." Unquote. This shows to us that every living creature and thing on earth, including man, evolved from one common primal form. Physical man must have passed through the same stages of the evolutionary process in the various modes of procreation as other animals have. He must have divided himself, then hermaphrodite have given birth parthenogenetically, on the immaculate principle, to his young ones. The next stage would be the oviparous, at first without any fructifying element, then with the help of the fertilitary spore. And only after the final and definite evolution of both sexes would it become a distinct male and female, when reproduction through sexual union would grow into universal law. So far, all this is scientifically proven. There remains but one thing to be ascertained: the plain and comprehensively described processes of such anti-sexual reproduction. This is done in the occult books, a slight outline which was attempted by the writer in part 1 of this volume. Either this, or man is a distinct being. Occult philosophy may call him that because of his distinctly dual nature. Science cannot do so, once that it rejects every interference, save mechanical laws, and admits of no principle outside matter. The former, the archaic science, allows the human physical frame to have passed through every form, from the lowest to the very highest, its present one, or from the simple to the complex, to use the accepted terms. But it claims that in this cycle, the fourth, the frame having already existed among the types and models of nature from the preceding rounds, that it was quite ready for man from the beginning of this round. Note: Theosophists will remember that, according to occult teaching, cyclic pralaya, so-called, are but obscurations, during which periods nature, that is everything visible and invisible on a resting planet, remains in status quo. Nature rests and slumbers, no work of destruction going on the globe, even if no active work is done. All forms, as well as their astral types, remain as they were at the last moment of its activity. The night of a planet has hardly any twilight preceding it. It is caught like a huge mammoth by an avalanche, and remains slumbering and frozen till the next dawn of its new day, a very short one indeed in comparison to the day of Brahma. End of note. The monad had but to step into the astral body of the progenitors in order that the work of physical consolidation should begin around the shadowy prototype. Note: this will be pooh-poohed, because it will not be understood by our modern men of science. But every occultist and theosophist will easily realize the process. There can be no objective form on Earth, nor in the universe either, without its astral prototype being first formed in space. From Phidias down to the humblest workman in the ceramic art, a sculptor has had to create first of all a model in his mind, then sketch it in 1- and 2-dimensional lines, and then only can reproduce it in a 3-dimensional or objective figure. And if human mind is a living demonstration of such successive stages in the process of evolution, how can it be otherwise when nature's mind and creative powers are concerned? End of note. What would science say to this? It would answer, of course, that as man appeared on Earth as the latest of the mammalians, he had no need, no more than those mammals, to pass through the primitive stages of procreation as above described. His mode of procreation was already established on Earth when he appeared. In this case we may reply, since to this day not the remotest sign of a link between man and the animal has yet been found, then, if the occultist doctrine is to be repudiated, he must have sprung miraculously in nature, like a fully armed Minerva from Jupiter's brain. And in such case the Bible is right, along with other national revelations. Hence the scientific scorn, so freely lavished by the author of a modern Zoroastrian upon ancient philosophies and exoteric creeds, becomes premature and uncalled for. Nor would the sudden discovery of a missing link like fossil mend matters at all, for neither one such solitary specimen, nor the scientific conclusions thereupon, could ensure its being the long-sought-for relic, that is, that of an undeveloped, still a once speaking man. Something more would be required as a final proof. Besides which, even Genesis takes up man, her atom of dust, only where the secret doctrine leaves her sons of God and wisdom, and picks up the physical man of the third race. Eve not begotten, but is extracted out of Adam on the manner of amoeba, quote, contracting in the middle and splitting into amoeba B by division. See page 103 in the modern Zoroastrian. Nor has human speech developed from the various animal sounds. Haeckel's theory that speech arose gradually from a few simple, crude animal sounds, as such speech still remains amongst a few races of lower rank, as stated in Darwinian Theory and Pedigree of Man on page 22, is altogether unsound, as argued by Professor Max Müller, among others. He contends that no plausible explanation has yet been given as to how the roots of language came into existence. A human brain is necessary for human speech, and figures relating to the size of the respective brains of man and ape show how deep is the gulf which separates the two. Vogt says that the brain of the largest ape, the gorilla, measures no more than 30.51 cubic inches, while the average brain of the flat-headed Australian natives, the lowest now in the human races, amount to 99.35 cubic inches. Figures are awkward witnesses and cannot lie. Therefore, as truly observed by Dr. F. Pfaff, whose premises are as sound and correct as his biblical conclusions are silly, quote, the brain of the apes most like man does not amount to quite a third of the brain of the lowest races of men. It is not half the size of the brain of a newborn child, unquote, from The Age and Origin of Man. From the foregoing, it is thus very easy to perceive that in order to prove the Huxley-Hegelian theories of the descent of man, it is not one but a great number of missing links, a true ladder of progressive evolutionary steps that would have to be first found and presented by science to thinking and reasoning humanity, before it would abandon belief in gods and the immortal soul for the worship of quadrumanic ancestors. Mere myths are now greeted as axiomatic truths. Even Alfred Russel Wallace maintains with Haeckel that primitive man was a speechless ape creature. To this Joly answers, "Man of words, in my opinion, this Pithecanthropus alalus, whose portrait Haeckel has drawn, as if he had seen and known him, whose singular and completely hypothetical genealogy he has given from the mere mass of living protoplasm to the man endowed with speech and a civilization analogous to that of the Australians and Papuans," unquote, from Man Before Metals, page 320, and Joly, International Scientific Series. Haeckel, among other things, often comes into direct conflict with the science of languages. In the course of his attack on evolutionism in 1873, in Mr. Darwin's Philosophy of Language, Professor Max Müller stigmatized the Darwinian theory as vulnerable at the beginning and at the end. The fact is that only the partial truth of many of the secondary, quote, laws, unquote, of Darwinism is beyond question. Monsieur de Quatrefages evidently accepting natural selection, the struggle for existence and transformation within species as proven not once and forever, but it may not be amiss, perhaps, to condense the linguistic case against the ape ancestor theory. Languages have their phases of growth, etc., like all else in nature. It is almost certain that the great linguistic families pass through 3 stages. 1. All words are roots and merely placed in juxtaposition, radical languages. 2. One root defines the other and becomes merely a determinative element, agglutinative. 3. The determinative element, the determining meaning of which has long lapsed, unites into whole with the formative element, inflected. The problem then is, whence these roots? Max Müller argues that the existence of these ready-made materials of speech is a proof that man cannot be the crown of a long organic series. This potentiality of forming roots is the great crux which materialists almost invariably avoid. Von Hauptmann explains it as a manifestation of the unconscious and admits its cogency versus mechanical atheism. Hauptmann is a fair representative of the metaphysician and idealist of the present age. The argument has never been met by the non-pantheistic evolutionists. To say with Schmidt, "Forsooth are we to halt before the origin of language," is an avowal of dogmatism and of speedy defeat. Compare his Doctrine of Descent and Darwinism on page 304. We respect those men of science who, wise in their generation, say, "Prehistoric past being utterly beyond our powers of direct observation, we are too honest, too devoted to the truth, or what we regard as truth, to speculate upon the unknown, giving out our unproven theories along with facts absolutely established in modern science." Quote, the borderland of metaphysical knowledge is best left to time, which is the best test as to truth. Quoted from a modern Zoroastrian, page 136. This is a wise and an honest sentence in the mouth of a materialist. But when a Haeckel, after just saying that historical events of past time, having occurred many millions of years ago, are forever removed from direct observation, and that neither geology nor phylogeny can or will rise to the position of a real exact science, then insists on the development of all organisms, from the lowest vertebrate to the highest, from Amphioxus to man, we ask for weightier proof than he can give. Notes. It thus appears that in its anxiety to prove our noble descent from the Catharine baboon, Haeckel's school has pushed the times of prehistoric man millions of years back. See Pedigree of Man, page 273. Occultists render thanks to science for such corroboration of our claims. A note, this seems a poor compliment to pay geology, which is not a speculative but as exact a science as astronomy, save perhaps its too risky chronological speculations. It is mainly a descriptive as opposed to an abstract science. End of notes. mere empirical sources of knowledge, so extolled by the author of Anthropogeny, when he has to be satisfied with the qualification for his own views, are not competent to settle problems lying beyond their domain, nor is it the province of exact science to place any reliance on them. Note: such newly coined words as perigenesis of plastids, plastidule souls, within brackets exclamation mark, and others less comely, invented by Haeckel, may be very learned and correct in so far as they may express very graphically the ideas in his own vivid fancy. As a fact, however, they remain for his less imaginative colleagues painfully kenogenetic, to use his own terminology. That is, for true science, they are spurious speculations so long as they are derived from empirical sources. Therefore, when he seeks to prove that the origin of man from other mammals, and most directly from the catarrhine ape, is a deductive law that follows necessarily from the inductive law of the theory of descent. See Anthropogeny, page 392. His no less learned foes, Dubois-Reymond for one, have a right to see in this sentence a mere jugglery of words, a testimonium paupertatis of natural science, as he himself complains, calling them in return ignoramuses. See Pedigree of Man, notes. End of note. If empirical, and Haeckel declares so himself repeatedly, then they are no better, nor any more reliable, in the sight of exact research, when extended into the remote past, than our occult teachings of the East, both having to be placed on quite the same level. Nor are his phylogenetic and paleogenetic speculations treated in any better way by the real scientists than are our cyclic repetitions of the evolution of the great in the minor races, and the original order of evolutions. For the province of exact real science, materialistic thought it be, is to carefully avoid anything like guesswork, speculation which cannot be verified, in short, all suppressio veri, and all suggestio falsi. The business of the man of exact science is to observe, each in his chosen department, the phenomena of nature, to record, tabulate, compare and classify the facts, down to the smallest minutiae, which are presented to the observation of the senses with the help of all the exquisite mechanism that modern invention supplies, not by the aid of metaphysical flights of fancy. All that he has a legitimate right to do is to correct, by the assistance of physical instruments, the defects or illusions of his own coarser vision, auditory powers, and other senses. He has no right to trespass on the grounds of metaphysics and psychology. His duty is to verify and to rectify all the facts that fall under his direct observation, to profit by the experiences and mistakes of the past, in endeavoring to trace the working of a certain concatenation of cause and effects, which, but only by its constant and unvarying repetition, may be called a law. This it is what a man of science is expected to do, if he would become a teacher of men and remain true to his original program of natural or physical sciences. Any sideway path from this royal road becomes speculation. Instead of keeping to this, what does many a so-called man of science do in these days? He rushes into the domains of pure metaphysics while deriding it. He delights in rash conclusions and calls it a deductive law from the inductive law of a theory based upon and drawn out of the depths of his own consciousness, that consciousness being perverted by and honeycombed with one-sided materialism. He attempts to explain the origin of things, which are yet embosomed only in his own conceptions. He attacks spiritual beliefs and religious traditions millenniums old, and denounces everything save his own hobbies as superstition. He suggests theories of the universe, a cosmogony developed by blind mechanical forces of nature alone, far more miraculous and impossible than even one based upon the assumption of fiat lux out of nihil, and tries to astonish the world by such a wild theory, which, being known to emanate from the scientific brain, is taken on blind faith as very scientific and the outcome of science. Are those the opponents occultism would dread? Most decidedly not, for such theories are no better treated by real, not empirical, science than our own. Haeckel, hurt in his vanity by Du Bois-Reymond, never tires of complaining publicly of the latter's onslaught on his fantastic theory of descent. Rhapsodizing on the exceedingly rich storehouse of empirical evidence, he calls those recognized physiologists who oppose every speculation of his drawn from the said storehouse ignorant men. If many men, he declares, and among them even some scientists of repute, the whole of phylogeny is a castle in the air, and genealogical trees from monkeys, are empty plays of fantasy, they only in speaking thus demonstrate their ignorance of that wealth of empirical sources of knowledge to which reference has already been made. See Pedigree of Man, page 273. We open Webster's dictionary and read the definitions of the word empirical. Quote, depending upon experience or observation alone, without due regard to modern science and theory. This applies to the occultists, spiritualists, mystics, etc., etc. Again, an empiric, one who confines himself to applying the results of his own observations. Only, which is Haeckel's case, one wanting science, an ignorant and unlicensed practitioner, a quack, a charlatan, unquote. No occultist or magician has ever been treated to any worse epithets. Yet the occultist remains on his own metaphysical grounds and does not endeavor to rank his knowledge, the fruits of his personal observation and experience, among the exact science of modern learning. He keeps within his legitimate sphere where he is master. But what is one to think of a rank materialist whose duty is clearly traced before him, who uses such an expression as this, quote, the origin of man from other mammals and most directly from the catarrhine ape is a deductive law that follows necessarily from the inductive law of the theory of descent, unquote, from Anthropogeny, page 392. A theory is simply hypothesis, speculation, and no law. To say otherwise is only one of the many liberties taken nowadays by scientists. They enunciate an absurdity and then hide it behind the shield of science. Any deduction from theoretical speculation is no better than a speculation on a speculation. Now, Sir W. Hamilton has already shown that the word theory is now used in a very loose and improper sense, that it is convertible into hypothesis, and hypothesis is commonly used as another term for conjecture, whereas the terms theory and theoretical are properly used in opposition to the term practice and practical. But modern science puts an extinguisher on the latter statement and mocks at the idea. Materialistic philosophers and idealists of Europe and America may be agreed with the evolutionists as to the physical origin of man, yet it will never become a general truth with a true metaphysician, and the latter defies the materialists to make good their arbitrary assumptions. That the ape theory theme of Focht and Darwin, on which the Huxley-Haeckellians have composed of late such extraordinary variations, is far less scientific because clashing with the fundamental laws of that theme itself than ours can ever be shown to be, is very easy of demonstration. But note, the mental barrier between man and ape, characterized by Huxley as an enormous gap, a distance practically immeasurable, is indeed in itself conclusive. Certainly it constitutes a standing puzzle to the materialist who relies on the frail reed of natural selection. The physiological differences between man and the apes are in reality, despite a curious community of certain features, equally striking, says Dr. Schweinfurt, one of the most cautious and experienced of naturalists. Quote, in modern times, there are no animals in creation that have attracted more attention from the scientific student than the great quadrumana, the anthropoids, bearing such a striking resemblance to the human form as to have justified the epithet of anthropomorphic being conferred on them. But all investigation at present only leads human intelligence to a confession of its insufficiency, and nowhere is caution more to be advocated, nowhere is premature judgment more to be deprecated than in the attempt to bridge over the mysterious chasm which separates man and beast. Unquote. From Heart of Africa, Volume 1, page 520. End of note. Let the reader only turn to the excellent work on human species by the great French naturalist de Quatrefages, and our statement will at once be verified. Moreover, between the esoteric teaching concerning the origin of man and Darwin's speculations, no man, unless he is a rank materialist, will hesitate. This is the description given by Mr. Darwin of the earliest ancestors of man. Quote, they were without doubt once covered with hair, both sexes having beards. Their ears were pointed and capable of movement, and their bodies were provided with a tail having the proper muscles. Their limbs and bodies were acted on by many muscles which now only occasionally reappear in man, but which are still more normally present in the quadrumana. The foot, judging from the condition of the great toe in the fetus, was then prehensile, and our progenitors, no doubt, were arboreal in their habits, frequenting some warm forest-clad land, and the males were provided with canine teeth, which served as formidable weapons. Unquote. Note, a ridiculous instance of evolutionist contradictions is afforded by Schmidt in Doctrine of Descent and Darwinism on page 290. He says, man's kinship with the apes is not impunged by the bestial strength of the teeth of the male orang or gorilla. Mr. Darwin, on the contrary, endows this fabulous being with teeth used as weapons. End of note. Darwin connects him with the type of the tailed catharines, and consequently removes him a stage backward in the scale of evolution. The English naturalist is not satisfied to take his stand upon the ground of his own doctrines, and like Haeckel, on this point places himself in direct variance with one of the fundamental laws which constitute the principal charm of Darwinism. And then the learned French naturalist proceeds to show how this fundamental law is broken. In fact, he says, in the theory of Darwin, transmutations do not take place either by chance or in every direction. They are ruled by certain laws which are due to the organization itself. If an organism is once modified in a given direction, it can undergo secondary or tertiary transmutations, but will still preserve the impress of the original. It is the law of permanent characterization which alone permits Darwin to explain the filiation of groups, their characteristics, and their numerous relations. It is by virtue of this law that all the descendants of the first mollusk have been mollusks, all the descendants of the first vertebrate have been vertebrates. It is clear that this constitutes one of the foundations of the doctrine. It follows that two beings belonging to two distinct types can be referred to a common ancestor, but the one cannot be the descendant of the other. From page 106. Unquote. Now man and ape present a very striking contrast in respect to type. Their organs correspond almost exactly term for term, but these organs are arranged after a very different plan. In man they are so arranged that he is essentially a walker, while in apes they necessitate his being a climber. There is here an anatomical and mechanical distinction. A glance at the page where Huxley has figured side by side a human skeleton and the skeletons of the most highly developed apes in a sufficiently convincing proof. Unquote. The consequence of these facts, from the point of view of the logical application of the law of permanent characterizations, is that man cannot be descended from an ancestor who is already characterized as an ape, any more than a catharine tailless ape can be descended from a tailed catharine. A walking animal cannot be descended from a climbing one. And further, quote, Vogt, in placing man among the primates, declares without hesitation that the lowest class of apes have passed the landmark, the common ancestor, from which the different types of this family have originated and diverged, unquote. This ancestor of the apes occult science sees in the lowest human group during the Atlantean period, as shown before. We must then, goes on the Quatrefages, place the origin of man beyond the last apes, thus corroborating our doctrine, if we would adhere to one of the laws most empathically necessary to the Darwinian theory. We then come to the Promisiae of Haeckel, the Loris, Indiris, etc. But those animals are also climbers. We must go further, therefore, in search of our first direct ancestor. But the genealogy by Haeckel brings us from the latter to the marsupials. From men to the kangaroo the distance is certainly great. Now neither living nor extinct fauna show the intermediate types which ought to serve as landmarks. This difficulty causes but slight embarrassment to Darwin. Note, according even to a fellow thinker, Professor Schmidt, Darwin has evolved a certainly not flattering and perhaps in many points an incorrect portrait of our presumptive ancestors in the dawn of humanity. Quote from Doctrine of Descent and Darwinism, page 284, end of note. We know that he considers the want of information upon similar questions as a proof in his favor. Haeckel doubtless is a little embarrassed. He admits the existence of an absolutely theoretical pithecoid man. Thus, since it has been proved that according to Darwinism itself, the origin of man must be placed beyond the 18th stage, and since it becomes, in consequence, necessary to fill up the gap between the marsupials and man, will Haeckel admit the existence of 4 unknown intermediate groups instead of 1, asks the Quatrefages. Will he complete his genealogy in this manner? It is not for me to answer. Quoted from the Human Species, page 107-8. But see Haeckel's famous genealogy in Pedigree of Man, in the Pedigree of Man, called by him Ancestral Series of Man. In the second division, 18th stage, he describes Prosimiae allied to the Loris, Stenops, and Machis, Lemur, as without marsupial bones and cloaca, but with placenta, unquote. And now turn to the Quatrefages, the Human Species, on pages 109 and 110, and see his proofs based on the latest discoveries to show that the Prosimiae of Haeckel have no decidua and a diffuse placenta, unquote. They cannot be the ancestors of the apes even, let alone man, according to a fundamental law of Darwin himself, as the great French naturalist shows. But this does not dismay the animal theorists in the least, for self-contradiction and paradoxes are the very soul of modern Darwinism. Witness Mr. Huxley, having himself shown, with regard to fossil man and the missing link, that neither in quaternary ages nor at the present time does any intermediary being fill the gap which separates man from the troglodyte, and that to deny the existence of this gap would be as reprehensible as absurd. The great man of science denies his own words in actu by supporting with all the weight of his scientific authority that most absurd of all theories, the descent of man from an ape. This genealogy, says the Quatrefages, is wrong throughout, and is founded on a material error. Indeed, Haeckel biases his descent of man on the 17th and 18th stages. See Eveling's Pedigree of Man, page 77. The Marsupialia and Promisiae, genus Haeckeliae, ? Applying the latter term to the Lemuridae, hence making of them animals with a placenta, he commits a zoological blunder. For after having himself divided mammals according to their anatomical differences into 2 groups, the indeciduata, which have no deciduata, or special membrane uniting the placentae, and the deciduata, those who possess it, he includes the Promisiae in the latter group. Now we have shown elsewhere what other men of science had to say to this. As the Quatrefages says, The anatomical investigations of Milne Edwards and Grandidier upon these animals place it beyond all doubt that the Promisia of Haeckel have no decidua and a diffuse placenta. They are indeciduata. Far from any possibility of their being the ancestors of the apes, according to the principles laid down by Haeckel himself, they cannot be regarded even as the ancestors of the zoonoplacental mammals, and ought to be connected with the Pachydermata, the Edentata, and the Cetacea, page 110. And yet Haeckel's inventions pass off with some as exact science. The above mistake, if indeed one, is not even hinted at in Haeckel's Pedigree of Man, translated by Aveling. If the excuse may stand good that at the time the famous genealogies were made, the embryogenesis of the Prosimiae was not known, it is familiar now. We shall see whether the next edition of Aveling's translation will have this important error rectified, or if the 17th and 18th stages remain as they are to blind the profane as one of the real intermediate links. But as the French naturalist observes, their, Darwin's and Haeckel's, process is always the same, considering the unknown as a proof in favor of their theory. Unquote from the same source. It comes to this: grant to man an immortal spirit and soul, endow the whole animate and inanimate creation with the monadic principle, gradually evolving from the latent and passive into active and positive polarity, and Haeckel will not have a leg to stand upon, whatever his admirers may say. But there are important divergences even between Darwin and Haeckel. While the former makes us proceed from the tailed Catharine, Haeckel traces our hypothetical ancestor to the tailless ape, though at the same time he places him in a hypothetical stage immediately preceding this, Menocerca with tails, 19th stage. Nevertheless, we have one thing in common with the Darwinian school. It is the law of gradual and extremely slow evolution, embracing many million years. The chief quarrel, it appears, is with regard to the nature of the primitive ancestor. We shall be told that the Giancochan, or the progenitor of Manu, is a hypothetical being unknown on the physical plane. We reply that it was believed in by the whole of antiquity, and by 9/10 of the present humanity, whereas not only is the pithecoid man or ape-man a purely hypothetical creature of Haeckel's creation, unknown and untraceable on this earth, but further its genealogy, as invented by him, clashes with scientific facts and all the known data of modern discovery in zoology. It is simply absurd, even as a fiction. As de Quatrefages demonstrates in a few words, Haeckel admits the existence of an absolutely theoretical pithecoid man, 100 times more difficult to accept than any Deva ancestor, and that is not the only instance in which he proceeds in a similar manner in order to complete his genealogical table, and he admits very naively his inventions himself. Does he not confess the non-existence of his Zosura, 14th stage, a creature entirely unknown to science, by confessing over his own signature that the proof of its existence arises from the necessity of an intermediate type between the 13th and the 14th stages? If so, we might maintain with as much scientific right that the proof of the existence of our 3 ethereal races and the 3-eyed men of the 3rd and 4th root races arises also from the necessity of an intermediate type between the animal and the gods. What reason would the Haeckelians have to protest in this special case? Of course, there is a ready answer, because we do not grant the presence of the monadic essence. The manifestation of the Logos as individual consciousness in the animal and human creation is not accepted by exact science, nor does it cover the whole ground, of course. But the failures of science and its arbitrary assumptions are far greater on the whole than any extravagant esoteric doctrine can ever furnish. Note, of course, the esoteric system of fourth-round evolution is much more complex than the paragraph and quotations referred to categorically assert. It is practically a reversal, both in embryological inference and succession in time of species, of the current Western conception. End of note. Even thinkers of the school of von Hartmann have become tainted with the general epidemic. They accept the Darwinian anthropology more or less, though they also postulate the individual ego as a manifestation of the unconscious, the Western presentation of the Logos, or primeval divine thought. They say the evolution of the physical man is from the animal, but that mind in its various phases is altogether a thing apart from the material facts, though organism, as an upadhi, is necessary for its manifestation. On plastidular souls and conscious nerve cells. But one can never see the end of such wonders with Haeckel and his school, whom the occultists and theosophists have every right to consider as materialistic tramps trespassing on private metaphysical grounds. Not satisfied with the paternity of Bathybius, Haeckeli, plastidual souls and atom souls are now invented by them on the basis of purely blind mechanical forces of matter. Note: according to Haeckel, there are also cell souls, an inorganic molecular soul without, and a plastidular soul with or possessing memory. What are our esoteric teachings to this? The divine and human soul of the seven principles in man must, of course, pale and give away before such a stupendous revelation. End of note. We are informed that the study of the evolution of soul life shows that this has worked its way up from the lower stages of the simple cell soul, through an astonishing series of gradual stages in evolution up to the soul of man. See Present Position of Evolution, page 266. Astonishing, truly, based as this wild speculation is on the consciousness of the nerve cells. For as he tells us, little as we are in a position at the present time to explain fully the nature of consciousness, yet the comparative and genetic observation of it clearly shows that it is only a higher and a more complex function of the nerve cells, from the same source, note 22. Note: a valuable confession this, only it makes the attempt to trace the descent of consciousness in a man as well as of his physical body from the Bathybius Haeckeli still more humorous and empirical in the sense of Webster's second definition. End of note. Mr. Herbert Spencer's song on consciousness is sung, it seems, and may henceforth be safely stored up in the lumber room of obsolete speculations, where, however, do Haeckel's complex functions of his scientific nerve cells land him. Once more, right into the occult and mystic teachings of the Kabbalah about the descent of souls as conscious and unconscious atoms among the Pythagorean monad and the monads of Leibniz, and the gods, monads, and atoms of our esoteric teaching, into the dead letter of occult teaching left to the amateur Kabbalists and professors of ceremonial magic. Note: those who take the opposite view and look upon the existence of a human soul as a supernatural, a spiritual phenomenon, conditioned by forces altogether different from ordinary physical forces, mock, he thinks, in consequence, all explanation that is simply scientific. They have no right, it seems, to assert that psychology is in part or in whole a spiritual science, not a physical one. The new discovery by Haeckel, one taught for thousands of years in all the Eastern religions, however, that the animals have souls, will, and sensation, hence soul functions, leads him to make of psychology the science of the zoologists. The archaic teaching that the soul, the animal and human souls, or karma and manas, has its developmental history, is claimed by Haeckel as his own discovery and innovation on an untrodden path. He, Haeckel, will work out the comparative evolution of the soul in man and in other animals. the comparative morphology of the soul organs and the comparative physiology of the soul functions, both founded on evolution, thus become the psychological, really materialistic, problem of the scientific man. See Cell Souls and Soul Cells, page 137 of Pedigree of Man. End of note. For this is what he says while explaining his newly coined terminology. Plastidule souls, the plastidules or protoplasmic molecules, the smallest homogeneous parts of the protoplasm, are, on our plastic theory, to be regarded as the active factors of all life functions. The plastidular soul differs from the inorganic molecular soul in that it possesses memory, as stated in Pedigree of Man, note, page 296. This he develops in his mirific lecture on the perigenesis of the plastitude, or the wave motions of living particles. It is an improvement on Darwin's theory of pangenesis, and a further approach, a cautious move towards magic. The form is a conjecture that certain of the actual and identical atoms which had belonged to ancestral bodies are thus transmitted through their descendants for generation after generation, so that we are literally flesh of the primeval creature who has developed into man in the later period, explains the author of the modern Zoroastrian in Primitive Polarities, etc. The latter, occultism, teaches that a. the life atoms of our prana, life principle, are never entirely lost when a man dies, that the atoms best impregnated with the life principle, an independent, eternal, conscious factor, are partially transmitted from father to son by heredity, and partially are drawn once more together and become the animating principle of the new body in every new incarnation of the monads. Because b. as the individual soul is ever the same, so are the atoms of the lower principles, body, its astral or life double, etc., drawn as they are by affinity and karmic law always to the same individuality in a series of various bodies, etc., etc. Note, see Transmigration of the Life Atoms in 5 Years of Theosophy, pages 533 to 539. The collective aggregation of these atoms forms thus the anima mundi of our solar system, the soul of our little universe, each atom of which is, of course, a soul, a monad, a little universe endowed with consciousness, hence with memory. See Volume 1, Part 3, Gods, Monads, and Atoms. End of note. To be just, and to say the least logical, our modern Hegelians ought to pass a resolution that henceforth the perigenesis of the plastidule and like lectures should be bound up with those on esoteric Buddhism and the 7 principles in man. Thus the public will have a chance, at any rate, of judging after comparison which of the two teachings is the most or the least absurd, even from the standpoint of materialistic and exact science. Now the occultists who trace every atom in the universe, whether an aggregate or single, to one unity or universal life, who do not recognize that anything in nature can be inorganic, who know of no such thing as dead matter, the occultists are consistent with their doctrine of spirit and soul when speaking of memory in every atom, of will and sensation. But what can a materialist mean by the qualification? The law of biogenesis, in the sense applied to it by the Hegelians, is the result of the ignorance on the part of the man of science of occult physics. We know and speak of life atoms and of sleeping atoms because we regard these two forms of energy, the kinetic and the potential, as produced by one and the same force, or the one life, and regard the latter as the source and mover of all. But what is it that furnished with energy, and especially with memory, the plastidular souls of Haeckel? The wave motion of living particles becomes comprehensible on the theory of a spiritual one life, of a universal vital principle independent of our matter and manifesting as atomic energy only on our plane of consciousness. It is that which, individualized in the human cycle, is transmitted from father to son. Now Haeckel, modifying Darwin's theories, suggests most plausibly, as the author of the modern Zoroastrian thinks, that not the identical atoms, but their peculiar motions and mode of aggregation have been thus transmitted by heredity. If Haeckel, or any other scientist, knew more than any of them does of the nature of the atom, he would not have improved the occasion in this way, for he only states, in a more metaphysical language than Darwin, one and the same thing. The life principle, or life energy, which is omnipresent, eternal, indestructible, is a force and a principle as noumenon, atoms as phenomenon. It is one and the same thing, and cannot be considered as separate, except in materialism. Note, in the transmigration of the life atoms, we say, to explain better a position which is but too often misunderstood, it is omnipresent, though on this plane of manifestation, often in a dormant state, as in stone. The definition which states that when this indestructible force is disconnected with one set of atoms, molecules ought to have been said, it becomes immediately attracted by others, does not imply that it entirely abandons the first set, because the atoms themselves would then disappear, but only that it transfers its vis viva, or life power, the energy of motion, to another set. But because it manifests itself in the next set as what is called kinetic energy, it does not follow that the first set is deprived of it altogether, for it is still in it as potential energy or life latent, etc., etc. Now, what can Haeckel mean by his not identical atoms, but their peculiar motion and mode of aggregation, if it is not the same kinetic energy we have been explaining? He must have read Paracelsus and studied 5 years of theosophy without properly digesting the teachings before evolving such theories. End of note. Further, Haeckel enunciates concerning the atom souls that which at first sight appears as a cult, as a monad of Leibniz. The recent contest as to the nature of atoms, which we must regard as in some form or another the ultimate factors in all physical and chemical processes, he tells us, seems to be capable of the easiest settlement by the conception that these very minute masses possess, as centers of force, a persistent soul, that every atom has sensation and the power of movement. Unquote. He does not say a word concerning the fact that this is Leibniz's theory, and one preeminently occult. Nor does he understand the term soul as we do, for with Haeckel it is simply, along with consciousness, the production of the grey matter of the brain, a thing which, as the cell soul, is as indissolubly bound up with the protoplasmic body as is the human soul with the brain and spinal cord from the same source. He rejects the conclusions of Kant, Herbert Spencer, of Dubois-Reymond, and Tyndall. The latter expresses the opinion of all the great men of science, as of the greatest thinkers of this and the past ages, in saying that the passage from the physics of the brain to the corresponding facts of consciousness is unthinkable. Were our minds and senses so illuminated as to enable us to see and feel the very molecules of the brain, were we capable of following all their motions, all their groupings, electric discharges, we should be as far as ever from the solution of the problem. The chasm between the two classes of phenomena would still remain intellectually impassable. Unquote. But the complex function of the nerve cells of the great German empiric, or in other words his consciousness, will not permit him to follow the conclusions of the greatest thinkers of our globe. He is greater than they. He asserts this and protests against all. Quote, no one has the right to hold that in the future we, Haeckel, shall not be able to pass beyond those limits of our knowledge that today seem impassable." Unquote. And he quotes from Darwin's Introduction to the Descent of Man these words, which he modestly applies to his scientific opponents and himself. Quote, "It is always those who know little, and not those who know much, that positively affirm that this or that problem will never be solved by science." Unquote. The world may rest satisfied. That day is not far off when the thrice great Haeckel will have shown to his own satisfaction that the consciousness of Sir Isaac Newton was, physiologically speaking, but the reflex action, or minus consciousness, caused by the perigenesis of the plastidules of our common ancestor and old friend, the Moneron haeckeli. The fact that the said Bathybius has been found out and exposed as a pretender simulating the organic substance it was not, and since among the children of men, Lot's wife alone, and even this only after her disagreeable metamorphosis into a salt pillar, could claim the pinch of salt it is, as her forefather, will not dismay him at all. He will go on asserting, as coolly as he has always done, that it was no more than the peculiar mode and motion of the ghost of the long-vanished atoms of our father Bathybius, which, transmitted across aeons of time into the cell tissue of the grey matter of the brains of every great man, caused Sophocles and Aeschylus, as well as Shakespeare, to write their tragedies, Newton his Principia, Humboldt his Cosmos, etc., etc. It prompted Haeckel to invent Greco-Latin names 3 inches long, pretending to mean a good deal, and meaning nothing. Of course, we are quite aware that the true, honest evolutionist agrees with us, and that he is the first to say that not only is the geological record imperfect, but that there are enormous gaps in the series of hitherto discovered fossils which can never be filled. He will tell us, moreover, that no evolutionist assumes that man is descended from any existing ape or any extinct ape either, but that man and apes originated probably aeons back in some common rootstock. Still, as de Quatrefages points out, he will claim as an evidence corroborating his, the evolutionists, claim even this wealth of absent proofs, saying that all living forms have not been preserved in the fossil series, the chances of preservation being few and far between, even primitive man burying or burning his dead. This is just what we ourselves claim. It is just as possible that future should have in store for us the discovery of the giant skeleton of an Atlantean 30 feet high as the fossil of a pithecoid missing link, only the former is more probable. Next section is section 3, the fossil relics of man and the anthropoid ape.